We are now joined by political analyst Tsepho Kgadima. Tsepho, good day, and thank you for joining us.
Thank you.
Now, what is the risk that the Futuregrowth faces?
Look, the announcement that came out from Futuregrowth yesterday, I think needs to be read in context, but we need to read into what they didn't say. We hear what has been announced, but we really have to listen to what they didn't say. And what do I mean by that? Effectively, in absence of very cogent arguments and reasons as to why they would halt any further lending to the named state-owned enterprises, one can have to now come to a conclusion, first asking questions about the ownership structure of Futuregrowth Asset Management, which we know that it is an old mutual controlled entity with management holding the minority, but of course a very effective shareholding. And when you ask that, well, who is Old Mutual and who actually is on the board of Old Mutual, unfortunately you have to come to that conclusion that is there not politics involved. We have to bear in mind that one Mr. Trevor Manuel is actually the chairman of Old Mutual. And based on his pronouncements of late recently, you have to say, well, how can Futuregrowth have come up this? And I believe that what we are seeing with Futuregrowth announcement is effectively going to trigger an avalanche with many more asset managers who, based on what I would really regard as political machinations, who would follow suit and make such an announcement. And one has to ask a simple question. From an asset management point of view, we have to ask, what is the risk of default in any of these SOEs? To date, regardless of what noise has been happening, regardless of all the things that have been playing out in the public gallery, there hasn't been one default by any of the state-owned companies. What does that say? It tells us that these state-owned companies, they've got very strong cash flows, and resultant from those very strong cash flows have been able to service their debts from borrowings. So that is something that is worth considering. But also from a risk point of view, we have to take into account that all these SOEs, their borrowings are backed by sovereign guarantees. So in any event, in terms of rating of the debt instruments, which are the bonds that the state-owned companies have been issuing, they actually should be AAA rated, because the effect of a state guarantee means that the risk of default will be sitting at 3%. And the rating agencies, in their assessment of ratings of issuers, be it sovereign or corporate, and corporate in this case, will be that the likelihood of default would be sitting at 3%, and at 3% you surely should be AAA rated. And if you've got a AAA rated debt, therefore your cost of borrowing, your interest, should have been the lowest comparable to other AAA rated instruments in North America and Europe. But what we are seeing that the effect of this announcement is going to increase, unfortunately, the cost of borrowing for these state-owned companies. And that can only be good for those investors who are invested in the bonds of these SOEs, because their yield is going to increase as a direct result of the interest payment going up. So who does it benefit? It certainly prejudices the South African economy greatly, in that these SOEs, their ability to raise further finance for development and growth is highly impeded. But more so that on their existing debt, the cost has just gone that much higher. Therefore, it takes out the free cash that they would have generated to reinvest on expansion and growth. What can the state do? I feel that the government needs to be a lot more decisive, and there are a number of things that they should be doing. One of the things that, for unknown reasons, at least to me, is that they have not been looking at refinancing both sovereign and SOE debt. Because the interest, the effective interest rate in dollar terms of our sovereign debt is at almost double the rate what other similar bond issuances are on the same interest rate. So that certainly means that we need to decrease our cost of borrowing at the state level. So the refinancing of our debt, it's something that it puzzles me as to why government and with National Treasury it being its mandate, why that has not been done. But the announcement yesterday certainly is regrettable, and for me, I read it that it is really informed by politics based on the statement that the company Futuregrowth issued. When you look at all of that, it does not address the fundamental issues, being that are the state-owned enterprises at the risk of default? That has not been answered. And unless you answer that, everything else that has been said, we have to read it in terms of the political climate. And I have a strong suspicion that this announcement is meant to reverse the announcement that we saw coming out of cabinet last week, that there has been a presidential SOC's coordinating council, which will be chaired by the president. Okay. And that should not be allowed to really, I think, fester.
You've said a lot, I mean, from explaining what this means to the ramifications of what this decision, you know, is saying to us. But now the following question is, what are the objections that, I mean, to the government announcement from last week about President Zuma being the one who would lead the new panel to oversee the state-owned companies, and how does that impact their investments?
Look, there is a fundamental misunderstanding out there in terms of the role of National Treasury, in that the National Treasury has been made to be a super ministry outside of cabinet and outside of government. And that certainly, National Treasury have a duty to correct that it is a ministry within the government that is currently led by the president, and the president being President Jacob Zuma. So that is very important. They need to help the country by correcting that they are not a super ministry. The statement that we saw coming out of Futuregrowth, they are talking about the independence of Treasury. When one looks at even the Constitution, for example, there is no provision for such independence that is being spoken of, because it implies that actually Treasury needs to run contrary or in a different direction from what the rest of cabinet is doing. Now, when you look at the Constitution, it vests executive authority in the president. And because the Constitution vests executive authority in the president, who then appoints cabinet, and National Treasury is one of the ministries and part of cabinet, therefore, it should not be raising any alarm bells howsoever to the fact that the president will be chairing such a coordinating council. What we should have been inquiring of, and where I think the presidency has made a fundamental error, they have not communicated in a greater detail. They have not painted a picture that should assure all that indeed the intentions of establishing such a presidential coordinating council on state-owned companies, what are the objectives, what is intended to achieve. Because I would think that they would have established it with good reason. But they are failing to communicate effectively, and therefore they are letting rumor mongering and a whole host of suspicions to come up in terms of the intention. So they should do better. I believe that both the presidency as well as National Treasury, they are the ones that need to be leading to communicate, because since National Treasury is within the same cabinet, it is remiss for National Treasury not to have come up and allay the suspicions on the establishment of the Presidential Coordinating Council on state-owned companies. And at the same time, the presidency needed to have communicated a lot more clearer the intentions, the reasons, the ratio decidente, which is the rationale on the establishment of such. Because when we look at it, this economy, for it to be able to grow sustainably at 4 to 6%, as enumerated in the National Development Plan, certainly you cannot continue on the Washington consensus model of free markets, privatization, less regulation. It now demands that if we are to reach those economic growth goals, which we've enumerated at the 4 to 6%, that by 2030 there need to have been at least 4 trillion rand of investment in economic infrastructure. It therefore means that the state has to have a more interventionist economic approach. But that interventionist economic approach needs to be communicated clearly, needs to be articulated so that all understand the destination and why it is important for us to get there. So, if anything, I believe that I think the private sector in this case, the announcement coming out of Futuregrowth, they too owe it to South Africans to allay our suspicions that perhaps their announcement is political posturing and it is motivated by political reasons to achieve a particular end which cannot be in the interest of this country and this economy.
Now, at the rate things are going, should other asset managers follow Futuregrowth and its logic, and how badly will it impact the SOEs?
Well, what they will do or not do, I think that's, we wait to see. I would not be surprised if in the next few hours, days or so, we see more asset managers making such announcements. But what can the government do? We have to also take into account that we have not prescribed asset classes for investments for the various fund managers. And that is fundamental flaw currently in terms of regulation governing how the asset managers work, and also taking into account what we need to do as an economy to be able to ensure that there is equity, that in fact this economy works for all, works for the better of all in the country. So I'm saying that government and parliament needs to stop being timid. They need to effectively bring in regulation mechanisms. We need to take into account that pre-1994, in fact, there were prescribed assets. The mandates for investment for the various asset managers were prescribed. We removed those prescriptions, and by removing those prescriptions, we've made our economy more vulnerable. If anything, we have taken our fate into the hands of the private sector that is indifferent to what we need to achieve as a country.
I want to have a look at some breaking news coming in, then we'll continue our discussion with Kgadima. Breaking news coming in that the African National Congress has described Futuregrowth's decision as erroneous and unfortunate. ANC has noted the decision by Futuregrowth Asset Management to suspend loans to a number of SOEs as a result of concerns that the asset manager has in relation to governance and decision-making at these institutions. The ANC is concerned by the posture adopted by Futuregrowth. It is our hope that the Futuregrowth will engage with the relevant ministries and parastatals to discuss the concerns they have and together find a solution in the interest of the economy and country. Zizi Kodwa says government is making interventions to strengthen the SOEs, including an interministerial committee chaired by Deputy President Cyril Ramaphosa to oversee the stability. Accordingly, ANC says that Futuregrowth or any investor should await the outcome of these interventions before taking any preemptive stance.
Again, I make a point. The presidency needs to have been the one that are issuing that statement. But it is good that the African National Congress has come forth and to express their concern. And I agree with the statement that has been issued by the African National Congress this afternoon. But I'm saying, again, the Minister Pravin Gordhan, as well as the President, need to be the ones that, if anything, I think they should together be explaining the rationale. National Treasury is not outside of Cabinet. It therefore should not be seen as such. And the onus rests on Minister Pravin Gordhan to explain that he is not operating outside, is not an independent super ministry elsewhere, because it is part and parcel. That lack of communication and if confirming that National Treasury is part of Cabinet is what is contributing to the current confusion we are seeing, and seeing some of the decisions that most certainly are not there is no economic or commercial merit on the decision that has been taken, because even the company, in this case, Futuregrowth, they have not communicated the commercial or economic merit for their decision. What they have said is simply political, and I'm saying these are money managers. They are not political activists, and they should leave politics to the politicians. But certainly all right now, what lessons do we take from this? We really have to have a decisive approach. But at the same time, we need to start ensuring that the state starts to play an interventionist role to ensure that high unemployment, pedestrian, if anything, negative growth that is currently perpetual, perennial in our country, it must be addressed, and addressed decisively. The state-owned companies that have been referred to in this case, by the way, none of them have defaulted, even though some of them, if you take into account, Sanral has not been able to have an effective collection of the tolls on terms of the e-tolls in Gauteng. But yet the company has been able to meet its obligations. If it needs its investments to be shored up, those are some of the decisions that were made that now we have to correct and address to ensure that there is additional sources of income for it to meet its obligation. But all the other SOEs, certainly they have not defaulted. To date, there has been no default. Is there any immediate risk of default from any of this? The answer is no. More so because most of them, if not all, are operating with sovereign guarantees. And I'm questioning, why are they paying such high interest rates when ordinarily they should have been AAA rated, affected by the sovereign guarantees that they have? That is something that we should be addressing. And overall, for this economy to be able to function, for us to reduce the volatility in our currency, for us to ensure that we are not beholden to the credit rating agencies, which brings in a lot of uncertainty and therefore impeding investment in bricks and mortar in our economy. I am advocating that we need drastic monetary and fiscal policy reforms. And on the other hand, we need to move away from deficit financing, which currently we seem to be so much in love with. We need to move away from deficit financing. We also need to refinance our sovereign debt, which currently, I believe in 2015, from the numbers I've seen, the interest payments alone were over 130 billion rand in our economy. If we were to move away from deficit financing to ensure that we are more effective in terms of our collection, we need to very decisively address our antiquated tax code, which the numbers are there for all to see, that it is outdated and it is not effective. So the question that needs to be asked is that currently the economic policy approach that we have, is it appropriate and is it efficient to help us to achieve the economic growth that is sustainable? Because without economic growth that creates jobs, most certainly the stability of the whole country will the risk will just be heightened, and we can ill afford that.
Just one more question for you, Mr. Kgadima. As you've mentioned now about lending, debt, and so forth, Futuregrowth said it would resume offering loans and rolling over existing debt once it sees signs of, a proper oversight and governance. Given that the decision is based on reports, perception, what factual parameters will they use to reverse the decision?
From what they're saying, one of the things, effectively, they want to have a seat at the table in terms of how these state-owned companies are run. Because they are alleging that perhaps there is, they use words like patronage, so they effectively questioning the investment that have been made, that are they really going to generate the necessary cash flows and income to assure that there is repayment. But they need to do a lot more to justify. As I say, the onus rests on them more so because of their ownership and because of the people that sit on the board of their parent shareholder being Old Mutual. That is something that Futuregrowth cannot run away from. They cannot run away from the fact that Mr. Trevor Manuel, who has been a strong critic of this administration, is on their board, and has got immense influence in how the company decides in terms of its investment criteria. They need to assure us that clearly this was a decision that was based purely on the interest of ensuring that they can maximize a return for their investors or the funds that they hold under management. So they need to do a lot more to communicate, and I cannot overemphasize this. Money managers and business, they mustn't be politicians, because they misread fundamentally some of the things that are happening in terms that are currently playing out in the public. So all of us, but more so the people, again, I cannot overemphasize the importance of the presidency to communicate in clear tones, the importance of National Treasury to communicate in clear tones, and more so ensuring that the private sector itself, which today I believe they're sitting with over 800 billion rand funds that they are not investing in this economy. The retirement fund industry, collectively, both state and private sector, is over 5.4 trillion rand. So there's a lot of funds. It's not the shortage of funding, but it's the investment philosophy that unfortunately seems to be very much informed by political perceptions more than what really is happening, that this economy can grow at the 4 to 6% rate, but only if we learn some lessons. It is important to highlight that between 1963 and 1976, the South African government then invested 16% of the GDP into economic infrastructure. Today we are sitting at below 4%. For us to be able to achieve growth, unless we get back to those days, unfortunately, we are going to have a deferred dividend from this democracy.
Thank you very much, Mr. Kgadima. This is Tsepho Kgadima, political analyst, joining me in studio right now to discuss on the recent developments that are happening with Futuregrowth.